Now, the first phase which scholars who have written about Islam in this country talk about is the sketchiest part of the history because we have limited data. And one of the pioneers who contributed to our understanding, he was not studying Islam, he was studying languages from the old world and their impact in the new world. Leo Weiner at Harvard. I mean, in the 20s, he wrote 2 volumes, more than 1,000 pages, called Africa and the Discovery of America. And the thesis of his book was really that there were people from the old world who came to America before Columbus, and they influenced the languages of the Mexican native people. It's a controversial book at the time, but in retrospect, some of the scholars now, looking at the data, are beginning to find circumstantial evidence that are complementing some of his findings. And what we do know is, from Weiner's studies, that there were some words that the Native Americans had we could be traced back to some of the languages in Northwest Africa among the Mande-speaking people or the Arabic-speaking people. Now, from the circumstantial evidence, what we do know is that in the Arab sources, and this is where American history, Muslim history, and African history intersect. The British historian Basil Davidson, who wrote many books, and some of you are familiar with him, Lost Cities of Africa, Modern Africa, and many other books that he has written. I mean, he has been instrumental in popularizing the findings of some of the medieval Arab writers like Al-Umari. Al-Umari recorded for posterity the information that was obtained from Mansa Musa. And many of you school teachers, I'm so familiar with Mansa Musa, who in 1324 made a pilgrimage to Mecca, suggesting that there was exposure to Islam in that region of Africa where he came from. And that Mansa Musa told the historians and scholars and intellectuals he met in Cairo, because according to the accounts, I mean, his kingdom became known in the world because he was carrying so much gold, and he created inflation in Cairo. And of course, the word spread, and one of the cartographers in the Middle East, in Europe, Southern Europe at the time, made this big map of the world with Mansa Musa. But what we know from Mansa Musa's account, which has relevance for our study of Islam in America, is the fact that Mansa Musa reported that Mansa Abu Bakr II, his predecessor, had outfitted an expedition to travel across the Atlantic. Now, of course, when this evidence was presented to many of the academics who have been responsible for the canonization of American historiography, it was very difficult for many of us to accept. But that's what history is all about. We canonize history, and of course we make it the gospel truth, and no one else can come up with evidence. But then gradually you begin to see cracks in the wall because new evidence begin to come. And of course, in this case, Thor Heyerdahl was able to prove beyond reasonable doubt that you could certainly travel from the Mediterranean region through the Atlantic and come to the Americas, riding on boats made of reeds. And he proved that. He proved that you could build a similar kind of structure and travel across the Atlantic from West Africa and land in Cuba or in the Caribbean islands, thereby dispelling the idea that people could not have done that before. Now, what is very interesting is that the Mansa Abu Bakr account, of course, we only have the account on the other side of the Atlantic, what was reported about his expedition. But we don't have any evidence from the native sources here saying that Mansa Abu Bakr was here and that there were Arabs or people who are familiar with Islam at this end. So we do have evidence. Now, we also have evidence from the Arab sources that there were certain Muslim mariners. And there is one fellow known as Khaskhas in the literature who apparently traveled from Andalusia, meaning Spain, and came across the Atlantic into the New World. These are sketchy data we have. We have people like Ivan van Sertima, who is writing not from an Islamic studies perspective, but from an African-American, black nationalist perspective, who wrote that book called They Came Before Columbus. much of his work was really built on Weiner's study. And of course, he was able to get additional research that came out of excavation in the Caribbean and in other parts of South America to make his case in that book, which was controversial in the academy. But you have some interesting points which reinforce what Leo Weiner raised. Yes?
When did he publish Africa, the Discovery of America? I mean, that one.
Weiner, his book came out in the 1920s, 1920, I think 1922. Okay. Yeah, if you have the book, you know, you can get the reference. Yeah. Now, the point I want to make really is that we do have circumstantial evidence for this period, and we are beginning to get more and more data coming out. You have people like Barry Feld, who has his book called Saga America, trying to suggest that there were people who came here, and in this part of the United States, there were some people who came from the Middle East, the Mediterranean region, into the Americas before Columbus. Now, what we do know about Columbus is that Columbus spent many years traveling along the West African coastline before he came to the New World. Now, whether he was exposed to this story, which we now know, about Mansa Abu Bakar's expedition, we don't know. I mean, you know, like there was a big controversy when we had the 500-year anniversary of Columbus. I was at a conference organized by the National Council of Churches right here in New Mexico, Santa Fe. And they invited a group of scholars. They had Muslim scholars, Jewish scholars, Hispanic scholars, Native American scholars, and some African American Christians, it was a very interesting discussion. But the evidence we got was more about the second phase I'm now talking about.